The 2006 Templeton Research Lectures at Vanderbilt University feature Professor Rodney Stark, Distinguished Senior Fellow at Baylor University. Dr. Stark will be presenting his four-part lecture series, Neglect and Dedication, The Dynamics of Ancient Religious Markets. Part 4 in the series is entitled Christian Establishments and the Neglect of Faith.
Well, after 4 of these introductions, I've become addicted. Fortunately, these young people have put it all on videotape, so I can replay it at will. Because otherwise, 2 weeks from now, I'm going to suddenly get a terrible sense that I need some praise, and thank you very much. For the final lecture, what I'm going to talk about and try to explain are the empty churches of Europe. Empty today, empty for a very, very long time. Let's go back to the middle of the 4th century. Christianity has just become the official state church of Rome. Approximately half the population has been converted. Christians make up large majorities in the cities. But then in this moment of amazing triumph, the energy began to drain out of the Christian movement. It took them nearly another 1,000 years to become officially ascendant in Northern Europe, and more centuries before most Northerners fully accepted the faith, if they ever did. Even in southern areas where Christianity had achieved its earliest and its greatest success, the intensity of faith began a long decline. By the dawn of medieval times, few Europeans, whether rich or poor, attended Mass. Then, following the Reformation, the Protestants installed their state churches. These proved to be less energetic even than their Catholic predecessors, and religious practice continued to decline. In response to Protestant challenges, the Counter-Reformation occurred, and with it came serious efforts by the Roman Catholic Church to reignite popular religiousness. It's these historic patterns that explain the current level of religious participation in Europe, which is only modest levels of religious activity in the Catholic areas and virtually empty churches in the Protestant areas. Now for the details. Christianity was by far the most successful sect movement in history. Beginning as a tiny group on the far eastern edge of the empire, it surged across cultural and political boundaries, building a massive following as the rank and file Christians went out and converted others. It was not in those days a missionary faith. By the start of the 4th century, there were sizable Christian communities in most of the larger towns and cities. And all of this took place within the highly competitive Roman religious economy, which I described several lectures ago, which, despite eras of repression and persecution, mostly energized the Christians by exposing them to serious challenges from other faiths. Then it was at this point that Constantine embraced Christianity. Now, Constantine was not responsible for the triumph of Christianity. Rather, Christianity played a leading role in the triumph of Constantine. It provided him with substantial and well-organized urban support for his struggle to gain the throne. Even so, and contrary to the received wisdom, Constantine never outlawed paganism, and throughout his reign he appointed many pagans to the highest offices of state. He even continued funding some pagan temples. Nevertheless, although it surely was not his intent, Constantine pointed the potent Christian sect movement down the road to laxity and negligence, the kind of laxity and negligence that's inherent in subsidized official status, which of course is what he gave them. The profoundly negative effects of this development continue to shape European religious life even today. Now, Constantine doesn't bear all of the blame for transforming the Christian movement from a high-tension sect into a much lower-tension, much more amiable kind of religious movement, because religious movements, if they grow large enough, are always tamed to some extent. When it became increasingly conventional to be a Christian, inevitably, the movement became less accommodating, more accommodating rather, less set apart, less critical of society, requiring less intense commitment. But it would have remained a far different, far more energetic and responsible institution had it continued to operate in a pluralistic religious setting. Instead, when he designated Christianity as the official state religion, bad things happened. Overnight, Christianity became the most favored recipient of the near limitless resources of imperial favor. A faith that had been meeting in homes and humble structures was suddenly housed in magnificent public buildings. A clergy recruited from the people and modestly sustained by member contributions suddenly gained immense power, status, and wealth. They were part of the imperial civil service. Bishops now became grandees on a par with Roman senators, and they hobnobbed in these circles. And as these privileges and exemptions expanded, what happened was a stampede into the priesthood. Christian offices became another form of imperial preferment, and they were soon filled by the sons of the aristocracy. As with the professional priesthoods in Sumer and Egypt, there was no obligation for one to be morally qualified, let alone that one be called. Gaining a church position was mainly a matter of influence, commerce, and eventually of heredity. An extensive and very expensive traffic in religious offices developed, involving not only the sale of high offices, such as bishoprics and whatnot, but even the lowliest parish placement was for sale. And there soon arose great clerical families, lasted for centuries, whose sons followed their fathers, their uncles, and their grandfathers into holy office, including becoming pope. Soon in the upper reaches of the church, everyone was related to everyone else. For example, a sample of medieval saints. 20% of medieval saints had a family member who was also a saint. Of course, the saints were exceptions to the lack of clerical commitment. The vast majority of those from the clerical families were more than willing to do, as Adam Smith put it so well, to repose themselves upon their benefices and pursue luxury and ease. Constantine didn't outlaw paganism, nor did he condone persecution of non-Christians. But other emperors did not share his notions about pluralism, and soon all non-Christian faiths were prohibited, with the exception of Jews, of course. Christianity was now a monopoly state religion, served by a lax, negligent, often corrupt and worldly priesthood. Not all the clergy, of course, for some still lived the exemplary lives of saints. But for a long time, even they ignored the commission to go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations. Keep in mind that early Christianity was overwhelmingly an urban movement. And they took very, very little interest in converting the rural peasantry. They shared the bias of urban Romans that these were nothing but ignorant brutes, and there was absolutely nothing in the New Testament about spreading the word to the beasts of the field. So as they continued to worship idols and whatnot out in the countryside, eventually their sacrilege caused enough consternation that repression occurred, and of course the countryside was more or less Christianized. By the way, you must understand, the word pagan comes from a Roman word meaning country hick. And there came a time, you see, when the cities were Christian and the peasants had still been neglected, and so they were still pagans, and the word came to mean, of course, without Christianity and et cetera, but it really only means hick or rube or country person or Willie Nelson or what have you. There is no known instance before the fall of Rome of anyone having been commissioned to go beyond the old boundaries of the empire seeking any converts. And then, of course, Rome fell. And the barbarians came in. And the church fathers soon realized that something had to be done about them. So they went to work on converting them, which wasn't too difficult because these people, already knew something about Christianity. Things had been oozing and seeping across the borders. And they also were totally impressed by everything Roman, walking around looking at those big buildings and whatnot, and they were quite ready to become Christians. But of course, soon after that, the really powerful barbarian kingdoms arose in the north. And to deal with them, something more than seepage was needed. And here come the missionary monks. Christianity has always been extremely productive of sect movements. From the earliest days, heresies have been behind every tree and every bush with a new movement. And even at the height of its temporal power, the medieval church was surrounded with Beguines, Fraticelli, Cathars, Waldensians, Flagellants, Lollards, Hussites, and all the rest. But despite their number and their constant appearance, these overt sect movements were not the most influential outlet for the sectarian impulse. Far more subtle and far more successful was the continuing formation of monastic religious orders, which can be identified as encapsulated sects, giving outlet to those seeking a very intense version of faith while remaining within the boundaries of the church. Now, many of these the monastic movements expressed all kinds of heresies, but it was tolerated because they made no institutional challenge. So, pretty soon you've got monks, enough monks in Europe so that you can send them on missions of one sort or another, and they were. Now, as I've mentioned before, conversion is primarily a network phenomenon. It occurs most rapidly when people bring their own friends and neighbors and relatives and whatnot into the new faith. But there still is a role for professional missionaries, and this is particularly the case when there are severe boundaries which are kind of limiting the oozing and the flow of ordinary people back and forth across some boundary. For, of course, even professional missionaries to succeed is a two-step process. One, you got to go there and meet some people and convert them, finally. And then, of course, you hope that they will turn around and start converting their friends and relatives. So the ultimate outcome of any one of these professional mission operations abroad depends on who it is that the monks first hit on. If the initial bonds are to the general public, then the eventual outcome might be the conversion of the whole society. If they manage to bust themselves into some little subgroup, some ethnic subculture or whatnot, it'll be very difficult for them to break out of that. They have to really start over again. And when the initial focus is on the political elite, the eventual conversion of the whole society often is not accomplished. And in the cases at hand, what the monks did when they missionized the barbarians was address themselves in the first place to kings. Given their small numbers, maybe they had to, but it's more likely that they had a top-down notion of how society worked. They were themselves overwhelmingly from the upper classes. The monks were 75% of medieval saints, for example, were from the nobility. So they go over here, and they took it for granted that somehow if they converted the king or the duke or whatever and the court, that everything else would follow from that. And consequently, mostly this is what they did. And then they left the missionizing. I mean, they converted the king, they got the church declared the monopoly, they arranged to collect the tithes, and moved on, leaving behind a local clergy who were supposed to then get around to converting the people. But, of course, they were kind of a kept clergy. The tithes were rolling in. They were welcome at court, and who wanted to go out there and try to convert the people? And for the most part, they didn't. There have been some of my friends have argued that modern Europe is not becoming de-Christianized because it was never Christianized. They had a trickle-down theory, as I've just mentioned, of how you converted a society, and they kept waiting for it to happen, and it's not clear that it ever happened, but it also means that even moving in and converting kings was a very slow, long-term process. Sweden was officially pagan until the 12th century, Finland until the 13th. Their lack of missionary effort shows up in the fact that no missionaries of any kind were sent to the Lapps until the middle of the 16th century. It's not clear at all when popular paganism ever began to wane up in the north, if it ever really did. It was typical of the Norse, the average at least, person, and some of the nobility as well, to convert by including Christ and various Christian saints in their pagan pantheon. I think I may have mentioned a couple of lectures ago that in the Icelandic Langa book, it reads, Helgi the Lean was very mixed in his faith. He believed in Christ, but invoked Thor in matters of seafaring and dire necessity. The popular Christianity that emerged up north was a strange amalgam, including a great deal in the way of pagan traditions and celebrations, some of them only very thinly Christianized. Much can be said for some of those parts of southern Europe that initially had responded so strongly to the gospel message. Now, everyone knows, of course, we all learned in school, that once upon a time, Europeans were very pious. That in olden days, most people exhibited levels of religious practice and concern that today linger on only in isolated subcultures such as the Amish and the ultra-Orthodox Jews and Muslim fundamentalists. But like so many once-upon-a-time tales, this conception of a pious past is mere nostalgia. Most prominent historians of medieval religion now agree that there never was an age of faith. If anything, medieval Europeans, both clergy and lay, were even less religious than is the case today. Writing in the 11th century, the English monk William of Malmesbury complained that the aristocracy rarely attended church, and that even the most pious among them attended Mass at home in bed. I quote, "They didn't go to church in the mornings in a Christian fashion, but in their bedchambers, lying in the arms of their wives, they did but taste with their ears the solemnities of the morning Mass rushed through by a priest in a hurry. As for ordinary people during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, they had rarely heard Mass anywhere, entering a church, if ever, only for weddings, funerals, and christenings, and their private worship was directed towards an array of spirits and supernatural agencies, only a few of them recognizably Christian. Alexander Murray, a fine historian, his assessment of medieval Italian religious life is typical. Quote, substantial sections of 13th century society hardly attended church at all. He quoted the Handbook on Teaching Preachers by the Dominican prior Humbert of Romans, who advised his friars that, quote, reaching the laity involves catching them at markets and at tournaments, in ships, and so on, which Murray interpreted as a fair enough sign that they were not to be caught in churches. Indeed, Humbert went on to acknowledge that the masses, quote, rarely go to church and rarely to sermons when they do attend, so they know little of what pertains to their salvation. Finally, Humbert advised his friars to exert themselves because the regular parish clergy were so involved in gambling, pleasures, and, quote, worse things, that they too scarcely come to church. In similar terms, Murray quoted the Blessed Giordano of Rivalto, who reported that upon arriving in Florence to preach, he suggested to a local woman that she take her daughter to church, at least on feast days, only to be informed it is not the custom. The anonymous author of Dives and Paupers, about 1410, complained, quote, that the people these days are loath to hear God's service, and when they must attend church, they come late and leave early. They would rather go to a tavern than to Holy Church. In 1430, St. Antonio noted that Tuscan peasants seldom attended Mass, and, quote, very many of them do not confess once a year, and far fewer of those take communion. They use enchantments for themselves and their beasts, being ignorant and caring little for their own souls or for the keeping of God's commandments, which they know not. Antonino went on to blame most of this on, quote, the carelessness and evil conscience of the parish priests. Further support of these reports comes from an extensive survey of surviving parish churches in parts of Europe, which revealed them to be much too small to have held more than a tiny fraction of the local inhabitants. Indeed, it was not until late in the Middle Ages that there even were more than a very few parish churches outside of the cities and larger towns, and this at a time when almost everybody lived in the country. And even when rural parishes did appear, they suffered from neglect, and many, perhaps most, lacked a pastor most of the time. Eamon Duffy has estimated that during the 16th century, for example, up to 80% of the parishes in the Diocese of Geneva had no clergy. That religious participation was lacking even in the cities is not so surprising when we realize that going to church in, say, the 15th century required the average person to stand, and in the winter in an unheated building, hearing a service conducted in incomprehensible Latin. In fact, the priest may not have spoken Latin at all, but simply have mumbled nonsense syllables, for many priests were profoundly ignorant and untrained. In 1222, the Council of Oxford described the parish clergy as dumb dogs. It had always been thus. The Venerable Bede advised the future Bishop Egbert that because so few English priests and monks know any Latin, I have frequently offered translations of both the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer into English to many unlearned priests. More than 1,000 years after Bede wrote this, nothing had changed. William Tyndale noted in 1530 that hardly any of the priests and curates in England knew the Lord's Prayer or could translate it into English. This was confirmed by the Bishop of Gloucester, who systematically tested his diocesan clergy in 1531. Of 311 pastors, 171 could not repeat the 10 Commandments. 27 didn't know who was the author of the Lord's Prayer. The very next year, this English bishop found scores of parish clergy who could not tell who was the author of the Lord's Prayer or where it was to be found. Meanwhile, across the channel, St. Vincent de Paul, of used clothing fame, discovered on a visit home in 1617 that his local priest knew no Latin, not even the words of absolution, but merely muttered sounds. Similarly, in 1547, Bishop Gianni Bovio of the Brindisi Aurea diocese in southern Italy found that most of his priests, quote, could barely read and could not understand Latin. In the 15th century, St. Bernardine of Siena observed a priest who knew only the Hail Mary and even used it at the elevation of the host. Given such clerical ignorance, it's no wonder that most people knew next to nothing about basic Christian culture. But far more was involved than ignorance. Even when medieval people did go to church, they often went unwillingly, often having been ordered to do so by their Lord, and they behaved very inappropriately while they were there. It is problematical as to whether certain sections of the population of Britain at this time had any religion at all, according to the eminent historian Keith Thomas. When the common people did show up in church, they often so misbehaved as to turn the service into a travesty of what was intended. Members of the population jostled for pews, nudged their neighbors, hawked and spat, knitted, made coarse remarks, told jokes, fell asleep, and even fired off guns. Now, how do we know about this? We know about it from all kinds of presentations made to ecclesiastical courts and from scores of memoirs written by the clergy. Court records tell of a man in Cambridgeshire who was charged with misbehaving in church in 1598 after, quote, his most loathsome farting, striking, and scoffing speeches had resulted in the great offense of the good and the great rejoicing of the bad. And I suggest that even today we wouldn't get such behavior drawing cheers and claps in any Anglican church. As Europe passed out of medieval times, religious participation seems not to have improved, but the statistics on religious behavior do. Some of the most enlightening of these can be found in reports written by various Anglican bishops and archbishops following visitations to their parishes. Thus, the Oxford Diocesan Visitations of 1738 report that in 30 parishes in Oxfordshire, fewer than 5% of the total population had taken communion in a particular year. Other visitation reports yield similarly low rates of taking communion over the rest of the 18th century. If these were 20th century statistics, they would be routinely cited as evidence of extreme secularization. Summing up his historical survey of popular religion in Europe, Alexander Murray dismissed all claims of widespread piety. The friars of that era were not typical features in a freakish age, but were morally freakish figures in a typical age. Their mendicant life was a lasting wonder to their contemporaries. They were, of course, not simply Roman Catholics, but sectarians. The ability of the Church to encapsulate many potential sect movements into religious orders began to fail by the end of the 14th century, as its own clergy began to arouse public followings against laxity and worldliness of the Church. First came John Wycliffe, an ordained priest, an Oxford scholar, who launched the Lollards in about 1380 without leaving his rooms at the university. Not only did Wycliffe propose that the clergy ought to practice apostolic poverty, but he also taught that individuals must make their own peace with God, and therefore it was urgent that scriptural truth be brought to them. To this end, he translated the Bible into English. Eventually, of course, these people, the Lawlers, were driven underground by Henry IV, but survived to emerge in 1520 in support of English Lutherans, paving the way for the Reformation. And of course we know about Huss and his rebellion in Bohemia, and then on All Saints' Day, October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in the University of Wittenberg. Interestingly enough, this was not an act of defiance. Nailing it to the door strikes us as such a dramatic thing. This was the university's bulletin board. They nailed everything up there. And all this was is an invitation to hold a debate. Of course, he too was subjected to plots on his life, etc., etc. The thing that separated Luther from all the other people like Huss and Wycliffe and whatnot is that he gained the backing of some kings and princes with sufficient military power to withstand all efforts by the church to reimpose its authority. But if one looks more closely at why they supported Luther, the image of an idealistic nobility seeking an equally idealistic church is quickly dispelled. Kings and princes adopted Protestantism only when it was greatly in their material interest to do so. That is, some rulers stood to gain immensely from becoming Protestants, while others had little or nothing to gain. This factor is perfectly correlated with which ones stayed in the church and which ones turned Protestant. Let's start with the people who stayed Catholic. In 1516, only a year before Luther nailed up his thesis, King Francis I of France and Pope Leo X signed the Concordat of Bologna. It subordinated the church to the French crown, giving the king the right to appoint all of the higher posts in the church in France. 10 archbishops, 82 bishops, and all the priors and abbots and abbesses of all the many hundreds of monasteries, abbeys, and convents. Having already gained the power to tax church property, the Concordat gave the king direct control of church property and income. As the distinguished Owen Chadwick put it, when he wanted ecclesiastical money, his methods need not even be devious. This removed a very considerable temptation for the French crown to support the Protestants. In Spain, as in France, no reformation was needed. Eventually, by the time of Charles V, the King of Spain controlled the Catholic Church in all of Spain, in parts of Italy, and along in Holland and that whole northern and southern German sphere, ruled as the so-called Holy Roman Emperor. He collected the tithes, kept most of them. He appointed all the bishops. Even it was illegal for the Pope to publish any official pronouncement, including bulls, anywhere within Charles V's territory without his permission, which he never gave. In Poland, too, the church lands and the clergy were taxed. Only members of the Polish nobility could be appointed to higher church offices, and local landlords controlled the appointment of parish clergy. As Bob Wuthnow, who was here last week, and I understand gave a brilliant lecture, he explained the Polish nobility enjoyed sufficient control over the church that they had little incentive to turn Protestant. But for many other European rulers, the enormous value of church property within their realms and the continuing large financial extractions by the church, along with ecclesiastical interference and arrogance, provide them with compelling temptations to turn Protestant. The English had no favorable concordat with Rome. When Henry VIII seized the church, he wasn't a Protestant after all. He continued to burn Lutherans and Lollards. He couldn't say he was motivated by theology, and he probably wasn't entirely motivated by divorce. But surely he was motivated by stripping the altars and seizing the wealth and seizing enormous amounts of church lands that were there to be had. He became immensely wealthy from this act. The German princes and electors, in the north at least, had no legal power to stem the flow of funds to Rome or to limit the expansion of the church, which continued to eat away at their tax bases. By turning Protestant and confiscating church lands, they made huge gains in income. Of course, these temptations didn't beckon any of the German prince bishops, since they already owned all the church property, and not one of them ever turned Protestant. In Denmark at the dawn of the 16th century, a third to a half of the tillable land was owned by the church. Everyone paid tithes, substantial proportions of which went to Rome. The Pope also made all ecclesiastical appointments. So in 1534, when Christian III became king, having met Luther and being well aware of what the confiscations were yielding in Germany, he took all the church property at enormous gains. Meanwhile, in Sweden, Gustav I drove out the Danes and found himself needing money very badly. He declared Sweden a Protestant state, and he gained all this enormous wealth of the church, even after settling enormous amounts of his church land on his supporters. He still increased his crown lands fourfold. And of course, there's another factor here. When kings would suddenly, or bishops, kings or princes or whatnot, would declare, no, now we're a Protestant country, nobody rioted. Nobody said a word. Maybe they would have in Southern Europe, but not in Northern Europe. I suppose that Helgi the Lean was still holding out for Tor, but nothing much went down. They didn't seem to care one way or the other. The primary consequence of the Reformation was to impose Protestant state churches on large parts of Europe. Although they were fully subsidized monopolies backed by the power of the state, they actually had very little power, being subject to control by the crown and eventually by parliaments. In a remarkably candid essay, the Swedish sociologist Goran Gustafsson noted that in Norway and Iceland today, the power of state church leaders is very restricted. Most important decisions concerning the church still rest with the government. In Denmark, decisions about church law, hymn books, and so on are taken not by the church, but by government and parliament. Despite objections of the Lutheran bishops, the Danish parliament recently passed a law requiring the ordination of women. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it strikes Americans as not being a parliamentary thing. In Sweden several years ago, a government-appointed commission under the supervision of a minister of ecclesiastical affairs, who was herself a non-believer, produced a new translation of the Bible, one that was cleansed of many traditional teachings. In any event, fully in accord with Adams, in Germany, for example, the labor contract says that if fewer than 7 people show up for a Sunday morning service, you don't have to hold it. Interesting. Probably many pastors are not motivated to draw a crowd. Now, European intellectuals believe their churches are empty because people have become sufficiently modern to dispense with religion. This is nonsense. Given what is lacking in Europe is participation, not belief. People believe in God. People believe in miracles. People even still pray. They just don't go to church. Secularization cannot explain Europe's empty churches. The real cause is subsidized state churches in the Protestant North and discrimination against non-Catholic faiths in the South. When confronted with this explanation, many Europeans claim that to the contrary, their societies enjoy full religious freedom. It's necessary, however, to demonstrate the extent to which this is an absolutely empty posture. Religious freedom in Europe is curtailed directly by various forms of repression and hindrance, and is compromised indirectly by favoritism for the state religion or a preferred religious organization. Consider this: in most of Europe, it takes many years for any religious group other than the state church to get a building permit. And even after you get the permit, should you get it, that building, once built, may never pass the many inspections needed to qualify it as a building suitable for public meetings. I know of Baptists in Europe who have taken 25, 30 years to get a church. Since 2005, it is a hate crime in Sweden for anyone, including ministers and priests, to read in public, that means in church, any passage of the Bible that is critical of homosexuality. The primary issue here is not the moral status of homosexuality, but religious freedom. Given the prevailing views, of course, of the Swedish state church and their clergy, this law was directed entirely against, quote, the sects. And in this regard, many European nations have been busy constructing lists of objectionable religious groups whose activities are to be limited or curtailed by denial or withdrawal of tax-exempt status, withholding permits to build churches or hold public meetings, and even by prohibiting their members from holding civil service jobs. On April 28, 1997, the Belgian Parliament's Commission on Cults issued a 600-page report classifying 189 religious groups as dangerous and suggesting that mind control be prosecuted as a crime. Among the dangerous groups were these: the Quakers, the Amish, the Assemblies of God, the Catholic Charismatic Renewal Movement, Hasidic Jews, Buddhists, the YWCA, but not the YMCA, and the Seventh-day Adventists. A year later came the French list of 173 dangerous sects and cults, including the Baptists and most evangelical Protestant groups. In Geneva, mind control is now a felony, and mere conversion to one of these cults, including the YWCA, is prima facie evidence that mind control has occurred. Norway hasn't produced yet a list of the undesirables, but all religions are required to register with the government. It is illegal to belong to more than one religious group, and a person must be over the age of 20 in order to take religious vows. Germany settled for declaring all groups other than the Catholic and state Lutheran churches as dangerous cults. Day-to-day government interference is rife. Necessary licenses are routinely denied. Tax-free status can be gained by any of these groups only by registering as secular groups such as sports clubs, but not as churches. Members of various religious groups are barred from civil service positions. Spain has only allowed non-Catholic groups to hold services since 1970 and still does not allow Protestant minister to be classified as a legal profession. The right to hold services was granted to non-Catholics in Portugal even more recently. And until 1984, the Italian government still paid the salaries of all Catholic priests and imposed many limiting regulations on all non-Catholic faiths. Religious freedom. What's neat now is we no longer have to depend on this kind of a recitation of anecdotal evidence. Recently, Brian Grimm and Roger Finke completed an exhaustive study of government practices vis-a-vis religious groups and have created an index measuring the extent of government favoritism towards an official faith. If you'd like to see the entire study, it's easily readable, you can look at the Interdisciplinary Journal of Research on Religion. This is a free online journal. It can be reached at religjournal, religjournal.com. I founded this journal. We pay authors $1,000 an article, so we're getting the best. What Grimm and Finke found closes the deal. Claims about religious freedom simply vanish. Their favoritism scale, and they work from official documents and reports, their favoritism scale varies from 0, absolute lack of favoritism, to 10, total favoritism. The U.S., Australia, and Taiwan score 0. Some people would say the government's against all religions, but at least that's equitable. Now, Afghanistan, where, as you all know, they've recently been contemplating whether or not to execute someone for becoming a Christian, gets a score of 7.8 on this 10-point scale. Iceland and Spain also score 7.8. Belgium and Greece, 7.5. Denmark gets a 6.7. Finland, 6.5. Every Western European nation scores well above the score achieved by Syria. And that's that. Of course, European intellectuals, especially those versed in the social sciences, ridicule the idea that it's lack of energetic churches that account for low levels of religious participation. Well, at the same time, of course, they ridicule the tasteless marketing activities of American churches. They remain steadfast in their conviction that religion is nearly dead and gone, and good riddance. They even sustain their faith in secularization despite a growing body of studies strongly suggesting that if Europeans encountered aggressive churches the way Americans do, they would respond as Americans do. Consider a recent study based on Italy. This does seem to be causing some of the European intellectuals a lot of unease. And some of their younger ones are defecting and coming over to the market approach to explaining religion. This Italian study was initiated by my colleague Massimo Introvigne, and we wrote the article together. Let me give you a very brief summary. Up until 1984, the Italian government paid the salaries of Catholic priests, period. Then they changed. They still collect the church tax, but they distribute it differently. Everyone is required to pay. But instead of taking the money and divvying it up according to, say, your membership or something, what the Italians did is put a little place on your tax form where you can indicate what church you want to get the money. I thought that was fair. It's like, you want to contribute to the presidential campaign on our tax form, bingo. Doesn't seem like anything very radical, but it led to intense advertising campaigns by various groups every year as tax time approaches, asking Italians to choose them as the tax beneficiary. One of their great ads, a little bit like, where's the beef? One of their famous ads was this person stepping on Italian television saying, I gave my church tax to the Baptists because I'm not one. Nobody knew what it meant. But it got them some money. Initially, it was only the Protestant groups who were investing in these ads, but the Catholics were not asleep. And so now every spring there's an absolute blizzard of these ads, Catholic and Protestant, urging you to give your money to them. But of course it isn't just come out and say, gimme, 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 gimme. All of them are advertising the virtues of faith. Why in the world should you be religious anyway? Some of the ads are extraordinarily well done, and they just constant din around tax time. And guess what happened? This started in 1984. We have world value surveys that include Italy in 1981, 1991, and 2001. 3 points in time. And over that period of time, church attendance has risen dramatically. So has prayer. These are based on large, each year is based on a very large national sample. The data are very stable, very reliable. Belief in life after death over this period rose from 44% to 59%. Belief in hell rose from 33 to 49. And this is not a case of elderly Catholics going back to the church. By far the largest changes occurred in the age group 18-29. I'm willing to call this a revival. Of course, there will always be dissenters. There are people who like to point out, well, yeah, but you've got church monopolies in Poland and Ireland and Quebec, and church attendance is very high there, or it used to be. Well, that doesn't falsify anything, because there's a little kicker here. External conflict can be an effective substitute from internal competition. In all three of these societies, the Catholic Church served as the primary organizational vehicle for resistance of outside pressure, from the Russians, from the British, and from Anglophones. Until recently, anybody in Poland, Ireland, or Quebec who failed to be an active Catholic raised suspicions about their nationalism. This interpretation is very evident in the following fact. The threat from the outside has greatly subsided in all three places. And what's happened to church attendance? It's been declining dramatically and rapidly, as in fact the consequences of no religious competition have kicked in, as nationalism has ceased being a great motive for going to church. Interestingly enough, today Catholics in Northern Ireland go to Mass almost twice as often as Catholics in the Irish Republic. In the North, if you don't go to Mass, they wonder if you're going to turn Protestant. Now, let me conclude by bringing it all home. It's instructive to realize that, contrary to popular opinion, during the early days of the American colonies, organized religion was as weak here as it was in Europe. The vast majority of early settlers were not Puritans, not even in Massachusetts, and they brought European traditions of little religious participation with them. Prior to the American Revolution, church participation remained low because nearly every colony had an established church. We forget that. The Congregationalists were established in New England, the Anglicans in most of the colonies. And the negative effects of establishment were already being recognized by some of the colonists. The former colonial governor of New Jersey, having retired in New York, wrote this to a friend. If by force the salary is taken from the people and paid to the ministers of the church, it may be a means of subsisting the ministers, but it won't make many converts. He went on to note that religion was far stronger in colonies having no establishment. And as the data became available, it's clear that he was right. In 1776, only about 17% of colonial Americans actually belonged to a local religious congregation. But New Jersey and Pennsylvania, the only large colonies without an established church, the membership rates were in 26 and 24 respectively, compared with 15% in Anglican New York. Now, the Constitution prohibits, of course, the establishment of a religion, but not for philosophical reasons, but because no denomination was sufficiently dominant to take over. The Congregationalists had only 20% of the congregations, the Anglicans 15%. American churches were placed on equal footing because they had to be, and the first thing they did was begin competing for members. And the benefits of pluralism quickly appeared. By 1860, more than a third of all Americans belonged to a specific local congregation. The 50% mark was passed by 1900. And for the past 30 years, slightly more than 60% have belonged. Now, this is in distinction from the 90% who will give you a religious affiliation. These are people whose names are actually on the list someplace. I mean, they can be traced. That's probably about as high a rate as you can sustain. I mean, there are a lot of things to do Sunday morning besides go to church. And some, of course, the wonderful evangelical churches have that figured out. And you drive by and they're advertising, first Sunday service, 6 p.m. Saturday evening. And the slogan, take her to church and then to dinner. It works. If a similar degree of authentic religious freedom and meaningful competition were ever to break out in Europe, I think it would soon cease to be that odd island of unchurched religiousness that it has been for so many centuries and from which it is different from all the rest in the world. I truly want to thank everyone at Vanderbilt for inviting me to come and give these lectures and the wonderful way they have treated me, and that's it. Thank you.
This has been a production of the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture at Vanderbilt University and National Television.